We begin, as we so often do, with a man the world had already decided to forget. Ezra Coldwell had been a farmer, then a soldier, then a farmer again, and by the autumn of 1887 he was neither. Only a stranger standing at the edge of a dying Montana mining town with $11 sewn into the lining of his coat and nowhere left to walk to. The bank that had once shaken his hand and called him neighbor had taken his land on a technicality no honest court would have allowed, and the men who might have spoken for him had looked away, because speaking for a poor man costs something, and few in that country could afford it. With 8 of his $11 gone to a room above a stable and a week of bread, Ezra had $3 left in the world when the county auctioneer, half out of pity and half out of boredom, sold him a boarded-up saloon on the dead end of Cutter's Gulch, windows blind with planks, roof sagging like a tired shoulder, the sign above the door so weathered it no longer said anything at all. Everyone in town called it foolish. Everyone but Ezra, who felt something in his chest when he first laid his palm against that splintered door, though he could not have told you what. He did not yet know that beneath the warped floorboards of that forgotten building lay a truth that had been buried on purpose, a truth that would not only save him, but call a broken town back from the edge of its own grave. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ezra Coldwell. If a story like this one has ever stayed with you, we'd be grateful if you'd let us know by liking the video and staying a while, because there is more waiting for you at the end. Ezra had been raised on the kind of Ohio farmland that rewarded patience more than luck. On 40 acres his father had cleared stump by stump with a borrowed ox and a stubbornness that ran in the family like a river runs through low ground. His mother, a quiet Welsh woman named Enid, kept a garden so orderly that neighbors came from 3 farms over just to see how she coaxed tomatoes to ripen 2 weeks ahead of everyone else's. And it was from her that Ezra learned the first true lesson of his life, that nothing in this world announces its worth loudly. The best soil looked like nothing at all until you put something into it. The best tools were the plain ones, worn smooth by use, not the shiny ones hanging and used on a peg. Enid used to say that a thing's value was never in how it looked sitting still, but in what it could still become in the right hands, and Ezra carried that sentence with him the way another man might carry a coin for luck. His father, Thomas Coldwell, was a blacksmith before he was a farmer, and he taught Ezra the trade in the small shed behind their house. The two of them bent over the forge on winter evenings while snow piled against the door. Ezra learned to read metal the way some men read faces, to know by the color of it in the fire whether it was ready to be shaped, to know by the sound of the hammer whether the strike had been true or wasted. It was slow work, unglamorous work, the kind that never made a man rich but made him steady, and steadiness, Thomas always said, was worth more in this life than most men understood until they'd lost it. Ezra grew into a broad-shouldered, quiet young man with his mother's patient eyes and his father's careful hands, the kind of son a small town trusts instinctively, the kind who is asked to hold the ladder, mind the till, watch the children, because something in his bearing tells you he will not let you down. When the war came, Ezra went, not because he loved the fighting, but because his father had raised him to believe that some debts a man pays simply because he is able to, and he served 4 hard years that left him older than his face let on. He came home in the spring of 1865 to find his father's health broken and his mother thinner than he remembered, and he took up the forge and the farm together, working from the gray hour before dawn until the gray hour after dusk, because there was no one else left to do it. In 1871, he married a schoolteacher's daughter named Margaret, a sensible, kind woman who could set a broken bone as well as any doctor in the county and who bore him no children, but who filled the house with a warmth Ezra had not known it could hold. Together they built something modest but whole, a farm that fed itself, a smithy that served 4 townships, a marriage built less on fire than on the deep, quiet loyalty of 2 people who had chosen each other and meant to keep choosing. It was, by any honest measure, a good life. It was not a life that asked to be admired. It was simply a life well kept, the way his mother had kept her garden, the way his father had kept his forge, with attention, with patience, and with the unspoken understanding that the things worth having were rarely the things that shone. That was the life the bank took from him, and it did not take it quickly, the way a fire takes a barn. It took it the way rot takes a beam, quietly, from the inside, until the day it simply gave way. The trouble began, as trouble in farming countries so often did, with a bad season stacked on top of a worse one. In 1884, a hailstorm flattened Ezra's wheat 2 weeks before harvest, and the following year a blight took most of what the storm had spared. Margaret's health, never robust, began to fail that same winter, and the medicines the doctor prescribed cost more than the farm could easily bear. Ezra did what any careful man does when the ground shifts beneath him. He went to the bank in town, to a loan officer named Harlan Beck, a smiling, soft-spoken man who had shaken Ezra's hand at church suppers for a decade and called him a credit to the county. Beck offered a loan against the farm, generous terms, he said, terms befitting a man of Ezra's standing, and Ezra, trusting a man he had broken bread with, signed papers he read but did not think to have a lawyer read for him, because in 18 years no one in that town had ever given him cause to doubt a handshake. It was, of course, exactly the kind of trust men like Harlan Beck were counting on. Buried in the fine clauses of that loan was a provision allowing the bank to call the full debt due without warning if a single payment arrived even a day late. And when Margaret's final illness took a turn that kept Ezra at her bedside instead of at the bank's counter on a bitter January morning, the payment arrived 1 day past its date. Beck called the loan due in full within the week. Ezra begged for time. Beck, still smiling, still calling him a credit to the county, said his hands were tied by policy, though the policy, as it happened, had been written into the loan by Beck's own pen. Within 2 months the farm, the forge, and everything Ezra and Margaret had built over 16 years was sold at a sheriff's auction for less than a third of its worth, and the buyer, unsurprising to anyone who had watched such things happen before, was a company with Harlan Beck's brother-in-law as its listed agent. Margaret did not live to see the auction. She passed in February, in the small rented room they had taken after the bank foreclosed, and Ezra buried her in a churchyard that was no longer, technically, in his town, because he had no town left to call his own. He stood at her grave with his hat in his hands and felt, for the first time in his life, entirely unmoored. A man of 44 with nothing but a mule, a bag of tools, and a grief so large it seemed to have swallowed the horizon. He drifted west that spring the way so many broken men drifted, not toward anything in particular, only away from the place that had hollowed him out, working here and there for wages, sleeping under wagons and in church basements, until the money in his coat lining had thinned down to almost nothing and his boots had thinned down worse. By the time he reached the Montana Territory in the fall of 1887, he had learned to walk with his eyes low, the way a man learns to walk when he has stopped expecting the world to offer him anything. And it was in that low, tired posture that he wandered into the half-abandoned mining town of Cutter's Gulch, following rumors of forge work that turned out, like so many rumors, to be nothing at all. Cutter's Gulch had once been a silver town, alive with the noise of stamp mills and the shouting of freight teams, but the richest vein had played out a decade before, and the town had been shrinking ever since, its false-fronted buildings standing half-empty along a single rutted street, its population down to a stubborn few hundred who farmed the surrounding valley or worked the last thin seams still paying out. It was a town that had the tired, patient look of a place waiting to be forgotten entirely, and Ezra, walking its street with his mule and his 3 remaining dollars, felt a strange kinship with it. He had planned to pass straight through, but the county was holding a small tax auction that very afternoon in front of the courthouse steps. Unclaimed properties whose owners had died or vanished or simply stopped paying what little was owed on them, and Ezra, more out of a tired curiosity than any real hope, stopped to watch. Most of the lots went for a few dollars each to men who wanted the land more than the buildings on it. But the last lot on the list, a boarded-up 2-story saloon at the dead end of the street, its windows planked over, its sign so sun-bleached the name had vanished entirely, drew no bidders at all. The auctioneer, a weary man named Coyle who seemed to want the whole business finished before supper, called for an opening bid of $3, mostly, it seemed, to be able to say he'd offered it. No one raised a hand. Ezra, standing at the back of the small crowd with nothing left to lose that the world had not already taken, heard himself say, $3. before he had entirely decided to say it. Coyle looked almost relieved. The gavel came down. And that was how Ezra Coldwell, a blacksmith with no farm, no forge, and no wife, became the owner of a saloon nobody in Cutter's Gulch wanted, called by the few old-timers who remembered it at all the Blind Mule, shut and boarded for reasons nobody seemed entirely willing to explain. He took possession the same afternoon, walking the length of the building with a borrowed lantern as the light outside faded, and found what $3 generally buys: very little. Dust lay thick as felt over the long bar, its brass rail gone green with age. Chairs sat overturned as though the place had closed in the middle of an argument rather than a business decision. Cobwebs hung between the rafters in gray, sagging curtains, and somewhere in the walls mice had built a civilization of their own. But Ezra, moving that lantern slowly across the room, felt something his exhaustion could not quite explain. Not hope exactly, but its first cousin, a small, stubborn curiosity, the same instinct his mother had described so many years before at her kitchen table, the sense that a thing's stillness was not the same as its worth. It was on his second morning in the building, while sweeping years of dust and dead leaves from the floor behind the bar, that he found the first clue. His broom caught on the edge of a floorboard that did not lie quite flush with its neighbors, and when he knelt to look closer, he saw that 4 boards near the back wall had been cut and fitted separately from the rest of the floor, joined with a craftsmanship far finer than anything else in the neglected building, dovetailed at the corners, the way a cabinet maker joins a fine chest rather than the way a builder lays a floor. Someone, long ago, had wanted these particular boards to lift out cleanly, and to be found only by someone who was looking closely enough to notice. Ezra worked his pocket knife into the seam and, after some patient effort, lifted the section free, revealing beneath it not the expected crawlspace of dirt and stone, but a narrow wooden stair descending into a cellar the town's own memory seemed to have forgotten the saloon possessed at all. He fetched his lantern and went down slowly, the air growing cool and mineral-smelling around him, and found himself in a room perhaps 12 feet square, dry despite its age, lined along one wall with shelving that still held a scatter of dust-caked bottles, and along the other with something that made him stop entirely still, a small iron strongbox, its lock long rusted, sitting undisturbed on a low table beside a stack of ledgers bound in cracked leather, and beside those, folded with the particular care of someone who had meant them to survive, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon gone the color of weak tea. He did not open the strongbox that first evening. He sat instead on the cellar's bottom step for a long while, lantern light trembling faintly on the stone walls, feeling the peculiar, hushed sensation of standing at the threshold of something another person had worked hard to protect, and understanding, in the way a careful man understands such things, that whatever was down here had been hidden on purpose, by someone who had wanted it found only by the right hands, at the right time. What Ezra found, over the slow, careful days that followed, was not treasure in the way a man dreaming of easy silver might imagine it, though it would prove, in its way, to be worth far more than silver to the town above his head. The ledgers, once he worked through their cramped, careful handwriting, told the story of a woman named Josephine Byrne, who had built the Blind Mule not merely as a saloon, but as something closer to a bank for men the real banks would not serve. The miners, mostly immigrant Cornish and Chinese laborers, who worked the deepest and most dangerous seams for the lowest wages, and who had no institution in Cutter's Gulch willing to hold their savings safely. Josephine, widow of one of the original prospectors, had used the saloon's back room as a kind of informal cooperative, taking in small deposits from men who trusted her more than they trusted any banker, keeping careful records, and lending modest sums back out at fair terms to families in trouble, to widows, to men saving passage for wives still overseas. It was, in its quiet way, the truest bank Cutter's Gulch had ever had, built not on paper promises, but on a woman's stubborn sense of fairness. The letters told the darker half of the story. They were correspondence, painstakingly preserved, between Josephine and a mining assayer named Franklin Dell, documenting a scheme run by the town's most prominent citizen, a banker and mine investor named Silas Vane, a name Ezra recognized within a day, because Vane's descendants still ran the only functioning bank left in Cutter's Gulch, the very institution that held the mortgages on most of what remained of the town. The letters revealed that decades earlier, Vane had bribed Dell to falsify assay reports on a rich vein the miner's own cooperative claim had struck, declaring the vein worthless so that Vane could quietly buy up the surrounding claims for almost nothing, then reveal the vein's true value once he owned it outright. Josephine had discovered the fraud, gathered proof, and confronted Vane privately, intending to expose him. And shortly after, the saloon had abruptly closed, its owner gone from town records entirely, no explanation given, the building simply boarded and left to decay for the better part of 30 years. The ledgers stopped mid-entry. The final letter in the bundle, unfinished, addressed to a territorial land office, spoke of Josephine's fear that Vane intended to silence her one way or another, and then there was nothing more. Ezra sat with that unfinished letter for a long while in the lantern light, and felt something shift and settle inside him. Not merely curiosity now, but a grim, quiet resolve, the particular anger of a man who has himself been cheated by a smiling banker and recognizes, with a cold clarity, the same pattern being played out here, a generation earlier, against people with even less power to fight back than he'd had. Whatever had happened to Josephine Byrne, she had not vanished by accident, and the vein she had died, or disappeared, protecting had never, as far as the town's later history recorded, been rediscovered. The town above him believed itself played out. Ezra, sitting in that hidden cellar with proof of fraud in his lap, began to suspect the town had simply been robbed of the truth. He did not act rashly. He spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly working the building by day, so as not to draw suspicion, patching its roof and clearing its rot, while by lamplight he cross-referenced Josephine's ledgers against the old claim maps he found filed, still public, at the county recorder's office. A mild, unremarkable-looking blacksmith asking mild, unremarkable questions. The same low posture he had carried west with him, now serving him well as a disguise for a sharpening mind. He learned that the vein Dell had falsely condemned lay not far beneath the surface of a ridge just north of town, land that Vane's family still held, technically unmined, technically worthless on the county's books, technically, and conveniently, exactly where Vane's bank was now quietly foreclosing on 3 struggling ranch families in order, it was said in town, to consolidate grazing rights. Ezra began to understand that history in Cutter's Gulch had a habit of repeating the same theft in new clothes. He might have kept the discovery to himself. A weaker or more desperate man, having stumbled onto proof of a hidden silver vein, could hardly be blamed for quietly filing a claim and walking away wealthy, and God knew Ezra had earned, by any reasonable measure, some small mercy from the world. But he thought of his mother's tomatoes, ripened patiently in soil no one else had troubled to tend, and he thought of Josephine Byrne's careful ledgers, kept not for her own enrichment, but for the safekeeping of men the world had already decided to overlook, and he found he could not make himself want the silver for its own sake. What he wanted, with a clarity that surprised him, was for the truth to finally be told. It was Ezra's inquiries at the county recorder's office that first drew Silas Vane's attention, and it came the way such attention always came from men like Vane, softly at first, dressed in courtesy. Vane, a spare, silver-haired man in his 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who had never once had to raise his voice to get his way, called on Ezra at the Blind Mule within the week, complimenting the repairs to the roof, admiring, with apparent sincerity, a man's willingness to invest labor in a hopeless old building, and then, almost as an afterthought, asking whether Ezra had found anything of interest in his renovations. Old bottles, perhaps, or papers, the sort of thing a previous owner might have left behind. Ezra, who had learned caution the hard way from Harlan Beck, answered mildly that he'd found little but dust and mouse nests, and watched something flicker, briefly and unmistakably, behind Vane's composed eyes. From that point forward, the town's quiet courtesy toward its newest, poorest resident began, subtly, to sour. The lumber yard that had extended Ezra credit for roofing nails abruptly required cash. The county assessor found reason to question the validity of the original tax sale, hinting that the deed might yet be overturned on a technicality. A rumor began circulating, traceable to no one in particular, that the stranger who'd bought the old blind mule was digging for something he had no right to, perhaps even planning to salt the ridge with false or samples to swindle honest townsfolk out of their savings. An accusation so precisely the mirror of Vane's own long-ago crime that Ezra almost laughed, if the situation had left any room in him for laughter. He understood, watching the town's mood curdle around him, that Vane meant to do to him exactly what had apparently been done to Josephine Byrne: isolate him, discredit him, and quietly ensure that whatever he had found in that cellar disappeared along with him, one way or another, before it could ever see daylight. It was the three ranching families facing foreclosure who tipped the balance. Ezra, walking the town those tense weeks with his eyes low and his ears open, began speaking quietly with them. The Alvarez family, the Petrick widow, and her 4 children, old Tobias Wren, whose grandfather had been one of the original miners in Josephine's cooperative ledgers, and found in their worn, worried faces the same expression he remembered seeing in his own mirror the winter Harlan Beck had called his loan due. He told them, carefully and without exaggeration, what he had found beneath the blind mule, and watched something long extinguished flicker back to life in Tobias Wren's rheumy eyes, because the old man, it turned out, still remembered his own grandfather speaking, in low and bitter tones, of a silver strike that had been declared worthless the same year Josephine Byrne vanished, and of a suspicion the old miners had carried to their graves but never dared to voice aloud. Ezra understood then that he was no longer merely a stranger defending his own small purchase. He had become, whether he wanted the burden or not, the keeper of a truth an entire town had been quietly denied for 30 years, and he resolved that whatever came next, he would not let that truth be buried a second time. He moved carefully and without haste, the way a blacksmith works a difficult piece of iron, testing, not forcing. He wrote to a mining assay office 2 counties over, a firm with no ties to Vane's bank, and paid the last of his money to have a sample from the ridge tested independently, the results arriving 3 weeks later confirming precisely what Franklin Dell's falsified report had denied: a vein of substantial, workable silver ore, exactly where Josephine's ledgers had said it would be. He brought copies of the ledgers, the letters, and the new assay report to a circuit judge passing through the territory that autumn, a stern, unbending man named Judge Halloway who had no particular fondness for bankers and a long memory for fraud, and Ezra told him the whole of it, plainly and without embellishment, the way his father had taught him to speak the truth of a piece of metal, not shaped to please, only shaped to be accurate. What followed was not the swift, dramatic justice of a dime novel, but the slower, more thorough justice of documents and testimony, which in the end proved sturdier. Judge Halloway, examining Dell's decades-old falsified assay alongside Ezra's fresh, independent one, alongside Josephine's meticulous ledgers naming names and dates, found more than enough cause to freeze the pending foreclosures on the Alvarez, Petrick, and Wren properties, and to open a formal inquiry into the original claim fraud, an inquiry that, once it began pulling threads, unraveled with the particular speed of a scheme that had rested for 30 years on nobody ever looking closely. Old Tobias Wren, called to testify, spoke at last the story his grandfather had never dared speak aloud, and 2 other elderly townsfolk, once they understood they would not stand alone, came forward with fragments of memory of their own, a hushed argument overheard outside the blind mule the week Josephine disappeared, a payment made quietly to Franklin Dell that no one had ever been able to explain. Silas Vane, confronted at last with a truth he had spent 30 years believing safely buried beneath a boarded-up floor, did not confess with any drama. He simply grew smaller, in the way such men often do once the town's respect withdraws from them. His bank's customers drifting quietly to a new cooperative institution the judge helped establish using the recovered ledgers as its founding model, his standing at church and council eroding week by week until he was, within the year, a man of no particular consequence in a town that had once bent entirely around his opinion. He faced no prison, for the fraud was old enough that the law's reach had dulled with time, but he faced something perhaps harder for a proud man to bear: the plain, unhidden knowledge, worn openly by every neighbor he passed on the street, that Cutter's Gulch finally knew exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost them. The vein itself, once properly claimed under the cooperative's original name, was not mined for any one man's fortune. Ezra, remembering Josephine's own careful purpose, insisted the new claim be held in trust for the town, its proceeds administered by the very cooperative bank her ledgers had inspired, its first payments going not to speculation but to clearing the Alvarez, Petrick, and Wren debts entirely, with what remained set toward a schoolhouse the town had wanted to build for a decade and never quite managed to afford. Ezra himself asked for nothing beyond the deed to the blind mule he had already fairly bought, though the grateful cooperative insisted on rebuilding its roof and bar properly. And within a year the old saloon had become, fittingly, the cooperative's first official meeting hall, its cellar stairs left open and unashamed at last, a small brass plaque near the old hidden floorboards bearing Josephine Burns' name, so that no one walking through would ever again forget what had waited, patient and unclaimed, beneath their feet. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a tired man standing before a boarded-up building nobody else wanted, $3 in his palm and grief still fresh in his chest, unaware that he was not merely buying a ruin, but accepting a trust another careful, overlooked person had left waiting 30 years for someone patient enough to notice it. Ezra Coldwell had lost a farm, a forge, and a wife to a banker's smiling cruelty, and he might easily have carried that loss forward as bitterness, hardening around it the way iron hardens around a flaw. Instead, he carried forward the other lesson his mother had planted in him long before any of it happened, that worth does not announce itself, that the plainest, most neglected things often hold what matters most, if only someone is willing to kneel down, brush away the dust, and look closely enough to see it. Josephine Byrne had protected her town's truth with dovetailed floorboards and careful ledgers, trusting that someday the right hands would find them. Ezra Coldwell, a stranger with nothing left to lose, turned out to be exactly the hands she'd been waiting for, and in restoring what she had hidden, he restored something in himself as well. Not his farm, not his old life, but a purpose every bit as steady as the forge his father had taught him to tend. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Ezra Coldwell, a man the world had counted as finished long before his story actually began. If his patience moved you, we hope you'll share this with someone who might need the reminder that value rarely arrives wearing a sign, and that the things others walk past without a second glance are so often exactly the things worth kneeling down to look at closely. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.